Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from the Kansas Beef Council is a voice for Kansas farmers and ranchers about the beef we eat. Want a great idea for dinner tonight? Recipes, information, and ideas are found online at kansasbeef.org. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas Soybean Commission, the soybean checkoff. It works for everyone.
Hello, I'm Rodrigo Lopez. I'm a producer at Smoky Hills Public Television, and I don't know much about agriculture. But my friend and collaborator Kyle Bauer does. In our conversations, we realize that there are a lot of myths and misconceptions about food production in the U.S. There is a big disconnect between the American consumer and the American farmer. And so we decided to create a show to bridge that gap. We call it Real Ag. Scientific facts from the people involved in the process. Straight talk from the producers of the food on your plate. Honest discussions of the topics that affect us all. No agendas, no special interests, just the information you need to know. A show designed to help you sort the truth and help you understand Real Ag.
Hi, I'm Kyle Bauer. When we buy beef, we're faced with a variety of choices. Most of these are represented by stickers and labels. These stickers are shorthand for information the consumer needs to know. However, many people don't fully understand what these markings mean. This can lead to confusion and frustration, as well as incorrect assumptions. Today on Real Ag, we'll discuss the meaning of each of these labels on your steak, along with all the information you need to know to make an informed decision at the supermarket. Let's talk about the properties of beef. Beef provides 3 vital nutrients: zinc and iron and protein. These 3 nutrients are very important for the process of the human body, being vital to enzyme generation, among other things. Although beef consumption is commonplace in the United States, other nations have very limited access to it. Zinc and iron deficiencies are a real problem in developing nations. In fact, 2 million children a year die in the world from zinc and iron deficiencies.
It should be pointed out that, beef is really an excellent source of nutrients for humans. Beef has an excellent source of iron that's very highly usable by humans. Beef is also an excellent source of zinc and vitamin B12, as well as providing a high quality protein. A quality protein is one that has all of the essential amino acids in a very optimum balance.
Let's talk about the USDA inspection sticker. It means that the processing of the meat was inspected by the United States Department of Agriculture personnel and has met their standards. It's important to understand what the USDA sticker tells us, but it's almost as important to know what it doesn't tell us. For example, the USDA sticker does not imply a level of tenderness or fat content or flavor. The USDA sticker does not denote country of origin, as imported beef is inspected as well. Before a foreign company can bring beef into the United States, the USDA will inspect the facilities as well. Beef sold at the supermarket is USDA inspected and graded. Certain stores, though, repackage their beef, so a USDA inspection sticker may not be presented at the retail counter on the pieces that you buy. Remember that as a consumer, you can always ask if you have any doubts about the origin of the meat that you buy.
Meat has to be inspected either by state or federal inspection to be marketed through retail outlets and labeled up to the point of cutting individual cuts and packaging. That just simply means that if it's USDA inspected, that means it's met all of the requirements set out by inspection, for sanitation, for contamination, for cleanliness, for packaging, that the vital organs have been inspected and no incidents of abscess or disease or anything in the organs. Inspection doesn't have anything to do with tenderness, flavor, juiciness, or quality of the product. It simply means that the animals were harvested and the carcasses and the meat was processed to meet very specific and rigid inspection standards established by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They have very strict standards in the stunning and the bleeding during the harvest of animals. And they have standards that animals have to be rendered unconscious, and there's several ways that you can determine that before the animals can actually be bled. And that's a very strict procedure and system that they have in place to assure that animals are stunned and harvested in a very humane way. But the tolerances are very tight, okay? And of course, if we get into extreme cases, then the plant can either be shut down, or there can even be a recall of products from those animals. So I would say that consumers ought to feel very confident and comfortable that USDA has a very excellent system for assuring that animals are stunned and bled and harvested in a very humane way.
Let's talk about country of origin labeling. This tells you which country the beef comes from. Simple as that. For example, a calf raised in Mexico and shipped to the United States for feeding, finishing, and processing still has Mexico as its country of origin. The main purpose of the country of origin label is so that the consumer, that's you, can support American producers if you choose to. It's not an indication of quality or processing of any kind. Grades are an indication of intramuscular fat or marbling. Fat generally means good taste and juiciness. The grade does not measure how tough the meat is. Most of the prime meat, which is the fattest and the juiciest, is exported to other countries. Japan, for example, is much more willing to pay higher prices for prime beef.
The industry still mostly relies on USDA graders through visual appraisal with some marbling standards that they have access to if they want to use those. The industry at the same time is moving more towards instrument grading. We call it camera grading. And it's been demonstrated that it actually is more precise than visual appraisal. In other words, from hour to hour, from morning to afternoon, from Monday to Wednesday to Saturday or whatever, instrument grading is more consistent or more precise than visual appraisal. And it's likely that within the next 2 to 5 years, grading will be done almost exclusively through instrument grading. At the same time, I need to point out that at this point, an instrument cannot determine differences in maturity of the carcass. So if there happened to be, let's say, a 4-year-old animal with fairly high marbling, they would not qualify for choice because the maturity, and that would have to be assessed by a grader. They primarily look at the split backbone of the carcass and evaluate the bone characteristics as well as the color of the lean. As animals get older, that lean becomes more of a darker, orangey red color and becomes somewhat objectionable, to most consumers. So that's how maturity is assessed. So there still has to be a USDA grader present, but it becomes more precise, consistent with the instruments, and it takes a lot of the pressure off of graders. There can be considerable variation in tenderness, even within the same quality grade. And fortunately, we also now have some DNA technology that can be integrated with actual measurement of tenderness to improve the accuracy and the consistency of selection, to improve either marbling or tenderness or both.
What cut of meat is this?
These would be briskets, boneless briskets, okay? And they're vacuum packaged. And the color of vacuum packaged meat is a darker, more purplish red color than what we saw in the steaks earlier, where they were exposed to oxygen and had that bright cherry red color. This is an excellent way of storing product that can be kept in these packages for several weeks and then opened up and then cut into portions, or in the case of brisket, probably sold as a whole brisket for barbecuing. The industry standard is that cattle are split, on the harvest floor into two sides, and then for grading, we call it ribbing. They're cut between the 12th and the 13th rib to expose the ribeye muscle with the outside fat still intact, and then they can evaluate color and marbling and determine the USDA quality grade from that. We can rely to some extent on USDA quality grades to determine or get an assessment of some variation in tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. The USDA quality grades start at the highest level of marbling, followed by would be prime, and then choice, and then select, and then the official USDA grade is standard, but oftentimes those are just identified as non-graded or no-roll product. Okay? Marbling would be the highest for the prime grade, and then would come in choice, and then select, and then standard. And then even further, the choice grade in recent years has been divided into kind of two categories. One would be what we would call premium choice product, which would be the upper 2/3 of the choice grade, and then the remainder would be choice. Okay? And common examples of premium choice would be certified Angus beef or Cargill's brand known as sterling silver. And these two steaks here provide, I think, excellent examples of differences in marbling. The one on my left would represent the equivalent of a certified Angus beef or sterling silver product. Okay, comes from the upper 2/3 of choice. And the one on my right actually would probably represent the upper part of the select quality grade. And I think you can see the differences in the amount or the numbers of flecks of fat, within the muscle. Nutritionally, the cut on the right, this high select cut, would have a lower caloric density than the cut on the left because it has less marbling or flecks of fat within the muscle. And we know that fat contains calories. So the nutritional, the caloric content of this steak would be less than the caloric content of this steak. In general, you can tell differences. You don't necessarily know whether it's one grade or another. For example, this steak on my right here, it's kind of what we'd call a borderline steak between the high end of select or the bottom end of choice. So you wouldn't necessarily know whether that's choice or select. But you can certainly tell the differences in marbling between this one that would qualify for certified Angus beef or sterling silver versus this one that has considerably less marbling. I would add that one of the primary benefits of marbling is when beef is cooked to higher endpoint temperatures, it provides a greater and greater assurance that the product is going to stay juicy and tender and be flavorful. In other words, if someone cooked a product to, let's say, medium rare or medium versus someone that cooks product to, let's say, medium well, marbling is going to become more important for someone that cooks that product to medium well or well degrees of doneness.
Quite honestly, fat equals flavor. Fat makes for a more forgiving cooking experience. Intramuscular fat in beef has oleic acid, which is the same monounsaturated fat present in olive oil.
What we're primarily talking about would be differences in saturated versus unsaturated. And of course, unsaturated can be broken down into polyunsaturated versus monounsaturated fatty acids. And it's interesting that beef actually contains a significant proportion of a monounsaturated fatty acid known as oleic fatty acid that is beneficial for health. In other words, in general, we think that monounsaturated fats are healthy friendly, whereas saturated fats in general are considered to be less friendly from a health standpoint. And it's interesting if we want to compare or contrast grain-fed beef versus grass-fed beef. Okay? The grass-fed beef would have a higher proportion of polyunsaturated fatty acids. Okay? And in general, consumers might think that that would be more healthful. But on the other hand, there's been some recent research conducted at Texas A&M that shows that marbling fat in grain-fed beef has a higher proportion of oleic fatty acid, which is the healthy fat from a health standpoint.
Let's explain just a little bit about the diet of beef. There's a lot of confusion about whether it ought to be fed corn or grass. First of all, 80% of the diet of beef are forages, which most people would call a grass. But conventional production practices will feed the cattle an 85% corn ration that lasts 100 to 150 days. This adds to the intramuscular fat, the tenderness, and the eating experience. However, there are significant quantities of grass-fattened cattle available. These cattle do not receive grain in their final days. By fattening on the grass, the animals are generally older because they don't grow as fast, but they are generally genetically selected to gain well on the grass and provide a good eating experience.
Feeding high-grain diets requires, I think, a more intensive level of management than just having cattle graze grass or consuming forages, because there can be problems with acidosis or some other nutritional imbalances when they're receiving a high-grain diet for a fairly extended period of time. Because of the energy level that the cattle are receiving allows them to deposit the excess energy in the form of marbling. Whereas cattle that are on grass will not gain as rapidly because the density of the energy in the diet they consume is just not as great, and so they're using most of that energy for muscle growth, for outside fat deposition, for maintenance requirements, and so on. So it's primarily a difference in energy density of the diet that cattle receive. And for, let's say, finishing at moderate harvest weights, rather than cattle that have to be fed, to heavy carcass weights to attain that level of marbling. Because the grazing season, at least in Kansas, is not really long enough, for cattle that have let's say, an extended growth curve or that are very muscular. Probably not long enough for them to graze on grass and achieve their optimum level of marbling. And when the grass starts deteriorating in quality, energy density, protein availability, then you're not going to have that extra energy for them to reach probably their genetic potential for marbling. Marbling fat has somewhat of a different chemistry than the outside fat, as we call it, or fat that is trimmed off. And so in grain-fed animals, we find that the marbling fat in grain-fed animals has a higher proportion of oleic fatty acid, which is good, even though they have less polyunsaturated fat. And it's perceived that the monounsaturated fat, which is oleic, is more healthy than the proportion of polyunsaturated fat.
Let's talk about the Angus label that you'll see on much of beef. First off, there's a difference between Angus beef and certified Angus beef. Angus cattle are black cattle. Over 55% of the beef in the U.S. are Angus. Certified Angus beef is a marketing program. The American Angus Association established a quality standard and protocol which greatly increases the eating experience of the consumer. So far, the program has been successful as each year the volume of certified Angus beef increases. Consumers have sent a clear message that they see a real value in this program.
For certified Angus beef, the animal has to be identified as at least 51% black-hided, and then when the carcasses are graded, they have to grade within the upper 2/3 of the choice quality grade, which is based primarily on marbling, and of course be within acceptable maturity level, which is not usually an issue. In contrast, sterling silver has the same carcass specifications, upper 2/3 of choice, but it can be from animals of varying colors. They do not have to be from Angus or Angus crossbred cattle.
Organic beef is not very easily purchased or raised. All the pasture and the grain and the parasite control has to be without the use of modern chemistry. Because this is very difficult and costly to do, organic beef is more expensive.
There's no such thing as hormone-free beef or hormone-free pork, okay? All of it has minute amounts of hormones, okay? Cattle typically are implanted once or twice or maybe 3 times, an implant in the ear that may contain an estrogen, it may contain synthetic testosterone, depending on whether we're talking about steers or heifers, or it may contain a combination of those factors. And that is beneficial to the animal for increasing growth rate, feed efficiency, and kind of minimizing the amount of waste fat that is produced. But there's essentially no carryover into the muscle tissue. So the hormonal profiles of hormone-free beef, as it might be called, and cattle have been implanted, there's essentially no difference. There are several vegetable type products that we could identify that has a considerably much higher levels of estrogen in it than beef does. And the one you mentioned, lettuce or peas or products like that. And when you think about the amount of hormones that might be present in beef, it'd be like thinking about, you know, a few blades of grass in a football field. I mean, we're talking about parts per million in most cases, and in some hormones it may be parts per billion. I think in general a lot of our society is just concerned about hormones and additives and residues in general, and hormones happens to be one that I guess strikes a negative tone in their way of thinking. But even within the natural products there can be variation. There are some branded programs that use the term natural in their name, which means that never ever has that animal been implanted. On the other hand, there may be some natural programs which means they cannot have been implanted within 100 days prior to harvest. So even within the natural category, there can be some variation in whether or not they have been implanted. Now, if you get into the organic labeling, then it's extremely strict in terms of never ever can the animals have been provided a growth-promoting implant or a beta agonist or the use of antibiotics. And they even have to be fed feed products that come from plants, from crops in which there's no genetically modified seeds used in their production. Those are set by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, organic, natural, and so forth.
That wraps up this episode of Real Ag. We hope that the information presented here has given you a better understanding of the steak on your plate. On behalf of the Real Ag crew, I'm Kyle Bauer, helping you sort the truth and helping you understand Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from the Kansas Beef Council is a voice for Kansas farmers and ranchers about the beef we eat. Want a great idea for dinner tonight? Recipes, information, and ideas are found online at kansasbeef.org. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas Soybean Commission, the soybean checkoff. It works for everyone.